Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Hudson Moura. I'm professor at Toronto Metropolitan University in film, media, and politics. I'm also the chair of Interactive Film and Media International Conference 2026. And today I'm going to present this paper entitled Exile-Image and the Fragility of Networked Memory, Forensic Architectures, Gaza Platforms as Interactive Archival Infrastructures. So this research is based on my doctoral and postdoctoral research called Image Exile in French. So I just published the book. But here I'm adapting the concept exile image to the interactive platforms for interactive platforms created by forensic architecture. Um, so we are focusing on contemporary memory, how these platforms they are changing our perspective and and our perception of documentary as a form of memory. So contemporary societies increasingly entrust collective memory of digital to digital infrastructures, such satellite imagery, geolocated videos, social media records, sensor data, open source investigations, interactive maps, and database-driven platforms have become central mechanisms through which historical events are documented, preserved, and transmitted. Yet, this unprecedented capacity to archive the world has generated a profound paradox. The more memory becomes digital, networked, and accessible, the more it depends upon in technological systems whose long-term stability remains uncertain. Servers fail, software becomes obsolete, interfaces disappear, databases become inaccessible, and entire archive ecosystems risk erosion through technological change. The central question confronting contemporary documentary culture is therefore no longer simply how events are documented, but how documentary traces survive. This question is particularly urgent in the context of interactive documentary in those interactive platforms and infrastructures. What must be preserved is therefore its entire infrastructure. This paper approaches this problem through the concept of exile image, developed in my previous work as an aesthetic and epistemological condition of displacement. Exile image originally described the detachment of images from stable, territorial, historical, and mnemonic frameworks. Rather than representing exile solely as a theme or lived experience, exile image designates a condition in which visual traces circulate between contexts, disconnected from their original, coordinates and depend upon new assemblages of meaning for their intelligibility. These concerns become particularly evident in the work of forensic architecture from the London University. It's a group of research, so they develop many platforms online. These concerns over the past decades, this agency has developed distinctive form of interactive documentary platforms, practice that combine architecture, digital forensics, cartography, remote sensing, geolocation, open source intelligence, database structures, and network interfaces. So the amount of information and resources that they present for each work, it's incredible. So this article examines four of these projects, these platforms, about Gaza investigations. So the Gaza platform, Israel 2014 offensive is the one. The second one is a cartography of genocide, Israel's conduct in Gaza since October 2023. The third one is humanitarian violence in Gaza. And the fourth and final, destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza. So each of them, they have their own platform, but they also create this ecosystem about Gaza investigation throughout these years. So the first one is, it's so more than 1 decade they're working on this. Methodologically, the paper combines conceptual analysis with comparative platform analysis. So drawing that comes from my book, from my doctoral and postdoctoral work, Gilles Deleuze's Reflections on Archive and Time, Maurice Blanchot's Philosophy of Fragmentation, Jacques Rancière's Theory of Visibility and Scholarship on Interactive Documentary. I examine the interfaces, navigational structures, database architectures, and evidentiary systems deployed across the 4 Gaza investigations. So my concern is really about the format, the form of how all these materials and information are presented, and what are our concern and les enjeux of all this. The analysis shifts attentions away from individual documents toward the technological environments that make documentary knowledge possible. So all this infrastructure, right? In doing so, it treats interactive archives not as passive containers of information, but as active infrastructures of memory whose operation shapes what can be preserved, verified, remembered, and contested. The article argues that forensic architecture's Gaza platforms crystallize a defining tension of contemporary digital culture. They demonstrate how interactive documentary systems can generate unprecedented forms of visibility, accountability, and democratic witnessing, while simultaneously revealing the fragility of technological infrastructures upon which such visibility depends. The future of documentary memory, therefore, depends not only on preserving evidentiary materials, but also on sustaining the fragile archival ecologies through which those materials remain meaningful. So I'm very concerned about how the longevity of these infrastructures, how this changing. So first, let's see the conceptualization, the theoretical approach for this work, for this analysis. Let's start with Exile-Image. So the concept of Exile-Image is rooted in a philosophical understanding of memory that challenges conventional notions of preservation and historical continuity. In Matter and Memory, Henri Bergson rejects the idea that memory functions as a repository in which the past is stored and later retrieved. Rather, the past survives virtually and coexists with the present as a multiplicity of temporal layers. Memory is not a static archive, but a dynamic process through which the past continually enters into new relations with the present. In L'Image Exile, I argue that exile reviews precisely this mobility of memory. Displacement does not simply remove images from their origins. Rather, it exposes the way in which memory survives through movement, transformation, and recontextualization. Images persist because they continue to enter new assemblages of meaning. Exile thus becomes a privileged condition through which the dynamic nature of memory itself becomes visible. While Henri Bergson provides the ontology of memory, Gilles Deleuze and Maurice Blanchot provide the conceptual foundation through which Exile-Image emerged as a theory of displacement. Drawing on Bergson, Deleuze argues in Cinema 2, the Time Image, that modern images no longer depend upon stable sensory motor relations, so action to action. Instead, they review direct relations between image, memory, and time. That is kind of the most important approach that Deleuze has to cinema, right? The duration of the time on the screen. The time image introduces situations in which multiple temporalities coexist and where actual and virtual dimensions become inseparable. Images cease to function merely as representations of events and become sites through which temporal multiplicities are experienced. So we really inhabit the screen, right? The time. We see the times passing and these correlations of temporalities on the screen. The Exile-Image emerged from this Deleuzian framework, detached from stable geographical, historical, or narrative coordinates. It survives as fragment circulating across temporal and spatial assemblages. Its meaning no longer derives from direct reference to an origin, but from the relations it establishes within new contexts. The image becomes a mobile configuration of memory rather than a fixed representation of the past. Maurice Blanchot extends this displacement even further through his reflections of fragmentary writing. In The Infinite Conversation, my Bible, by the way, I love Maurice Blanchot's book, this book. The fragment does not constitute an incomplete part awaiting reintegration into a lost whole. Rather, fragmentation becomes a condition of survival. Meaning persists precisely because it remains unfinished, interrupted, and open to future encounters. Exactly yet to be known idea, right? This openness that interactivity has the quality of these works. And especially in the forensic architecture that we have also real-time events that continue the work. So it's unfinished work. So this insight is central to Exile-Image. The exilic trace survives not because it preserves a stable identity, but because it remains available for recombination and reinterpretation. Displacement interrupts continuity while simultaneously creating new possibilities for meaning. The fragment does not signify loss alone, it also enables future relations. An Exile-Image identifies the condition through which traces survive displacement. The archive constitutes the environment through which those traces become legible. The Greek notion of arche already reviews the archive's dual nature, simultaneously origin and command. The archive preserves traces while determining the conditions under which they may be organized, classified, interpreted, and accessed. Archives, therefore, do not merely conserve memory. They actively participate in its production. Gilles Deleuze's reading of Michel Foucault is particularly useful here. Archives are not passive repositories, but historical formations that organize relations between visibility and discursivity. Every archive establishes conditions that determine what can appear, what can be articulated, and how knowledge becomes possible. Legibility is therefore produced rather than given. Contemporary digital archives intensify these dynamics. Their authority derives less from permanence than from connectivity, agency. What is preserved is not simply a document, but a relational environment capable of connecting heterogeneous traces. The archive thus becomes an infrastructure rather than a location. So the transition from the archive as repository to the archive as interactive platform transforms not only memory, but also visibility itself. For 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿, politics is inseparable from what he calls distribution of the sensible. The organization of what can be seen, heard, recognized, and rendered intelligible within a given social order. Visibility is therefore never neutral. It is produced through political, institutional, and technological arrangements that determine which subjects, events, and histories are permitted to appear within public space and under what conditions. Contemporary digital archives participate directly in these regimes of visibility. So just one example how these platforms, how they not only repositories, but also they continue creating mini and adding information, right? So contemporary digital archives participate directly in these regimes of visibility. Databases, metadata structures, search mechanisms, cartographic visualizations, interfaces, algorithms, and network architectures shape the conditions through which traces become perceptible and meaningful. Interactive documentary occupies a particularly significant position within this transformation, as so here another example. So warning, this platform contains media with sound that some viewers may find distressing. So here we have different information, right? So interactive documentary occupies a particularly significant position within this transformation. Sandra Godensi, Judith Aston, and Kate Nash have argued interactive documentary moves beyond linear representational structures associated with traditional documentary forms and instead operates through relational environments in which users navigate, connect, filter, interpret information. Forensic architecture represents one of the most developed manifestations of these transformations. Its investigations combine open source intelligence, satellite imagery, cartographic modeling, spatial analysis, database structures, geolocation technologies, and interactive interfaces into a complex system of network memory. The archive, therefore, functions as a living infrastructure through which memory is actively produced while events remain ongoing. In Bergsonian terms, these platforms do not simply store memory, but participate in its continued actualization. Deleuze extends this understanding through the time image where actual and virtual dimensions coexist and where meaning emerges through temporal assemblages rather than linear causality. Blanchot's reflection on fragmentation further illuminates this condition. The fragment survives not because it preserves a stable totality, but because it remains open to interruption, displacement, and future recombination. Yet the same infrastructure that generate unprecedented forms of visibility also reveal the uncertainty of digital survival. Their first future accessibility cannot be assumed. What must be preserved is no longer merely a document, an image, or a testimony, but the entire technological ecology through which these materials become searchable, navigatable, relational, and public intelligible. Forensic architecture Gaza investigations make this condition particularly visible. Through the framework of Exile-Image, these platforms can be understood as environments in which traces survive through circulation, displacement, recombination, and continued technological mediation. They reveal a defining paradox of contemporary documentary culture. Visibility has never been more extensive, yet the systems upon which that visibility depends have rarely been more contingent. The four platforms review successive stages in transformation of documentary. So the first platform is the Gaza platform, Israel's 2014 offensive. So here we have some information. So this is kind of the Forensic Architecture website with a link to visit the platform. So released in 2015 through a collaboration between Forensic Architecture and Amnesty International, the Al-Mazen Center for Human Rights, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. The Gaza platform represents one of the earliest examples of interactive archival environment organized around the large-scale aggregation of documentary traces. Built upon the open source pattern software, the platform was designed not simply to preserve information, but to establish relationships among thousands of events distributed across space and time. So we don't have a complete because of the sharing, but if you visit the platform, you're going to see more detail here in this platform, like we can see in these photos, like here or here, right? All the information. So the significance of the platform lies in the way it transformed fragmented documentation into a navigable memory system. Users move continuously between micro and macro scales, examining individual incidents while simultaneously visualizing larger territorial and temporal patterns. Events can be grouped, reorganized, compared, and correlated according to multiple criteria. Events can be grouped, reorganized, compared, allowing new forms of interpretation to emerge through navigation itself. Memory becomes relational rather than linear. The archive itself becomes the documentary environment. So we have sometimes many methodologies. Also, you have continue of the press, the main researchers, the investigators, right? Eyal-Weizman, that's one of the founders of these platforms. So the explanations, the links to all this. And some links, of course, with time they become dated, right? So we need to, that's one of the challenges of this because we need to update very constantly. So the other one is a cartography of genocide Israel's conduct in Gaza since 2023. So this is the platform. So here we have the information, right? So this platform transforms Gaza into a continuously evolving archive in which destruction, displacement, military operations, environmental damage, infrastructure collapse, and humanitarian restrictions can be examined through interconnected spatial layers. These platforms accumulate traces while events remain ongoing. The platform's layered cartographic structure allows users to navigate among multiple dimensions of violence. Its boundaries remain open, continuously integrating new traces in new forms of documentation. The archive is never complete because the conditions it documents remain unfinished. So we can see since 2003, 2004, right? We still have being updated and the amount of information, it's incredible, right? And you can open to other sites to be updated. So the third one is the humanitarian violence in Gaza. So here the focus shifts from the direct documentation of military violence toward the spatial and temporal dynamics of forced mobility. Through geospatial reconstruction, satellites analysis, open source intelligence, and cartographic modeling, the platform examines evacuation orders, humanitarian corridors, safe routes, checkpoints, and designated safe zones. Rather than treating displacement as a singular event, the project reviews it as an ongoing process organized through successive cycles of movement, restriction, and relocation. Layered maps allow users to reconstruct changing patterns of displacement across Gaza. The platform transforms displacement into a navigable memory system. It transforms exile itself into an archival condition. Exile ceases to function merely as a social experience and becomes inscribed within the spatial memory of the platform itself. The archive records not only displacement, but the continuously changing geographies through which displacement is produced. So here we can also launch the platform. So we have the checkpoints, refugee camps. We have a density of information, right? So the first and final is destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza. This investigation represents one of the most complex examples of interactive archival practice developed by forensic architecture. The project is distributed across multiple interconnected environments, linking maps, timelines, testimonies, satellite imagery, audiovisual documentation, institutional reports, and geospatial analysis. The project's methodological significance lies in its capacity to correlate heterogeneous traces without reducing them to a singular narrative framework. Different forms of documentation remain distinct while simultaneously contributing to a broader relational understanding of the conflict. Can launch the platform here. The project's methodological significance lies in its capacity to correlate heterogeneous traces without reducing them to a singular narrative framework. Different forms of documentation remain distinct while simultaneously contributing to a broader relational understanding of the conflict. The archive functions through cognitivity rather than hierarchy. Medical collapse appears not as the result of singular incident, but as evolving condition produced through multiple interconnected forms of violence. Hospitals function simultaneously as sites of destructions, sites of remembrance, and points of connection within a broader archived ecology that preserve the fragmented history of the conflict. Taking together these four platforms reveal the emergence of a new archival paradigm distributed across technological environments that remain open, expandable, and perpetually unfinished. Gaza thus appears not merely as a site of conflict, but as a dynamic ecology of network memory in which traces survive through continual processes of circulation, recombination, updating, and technological mediation. Interactivity is therefore not simply a technological affordance or aesthetic feature added to documentary materials. It constitutes an archival protocol that organizes how memory is produced, activated, verified, and contested. At the same time, these platforms reveal a central paradox of contemporary digital culture. Never before have archives possessed such capacities for visibility, cognitivity, and public accessibility, yet have memory infrastructures dependent so heavily upon technological systems whose future stability remains uncertain. The same platforms that enable unprecedented forms of documentary memory also expose memory to new forms of fragility. Databases, interfaces, maps, tags, timelines, filters, and visualizations create environments in which users actively engage with documentary materials rather than simply receive them. The Gaza platforms illustrate this transformation particularly clearly. Zooming allows movement between territorial and local scales. Filtering enables a selective exploration of specific categories of information. Temporal layering allows users to reconstruct evolving processes rather than isolated events. Through these mechanisms, memory emerges not as a fixed narrative, but as a dynamic process of navigation. In Bergsonian terms, these platforms do not simply preserve memory, but continually actualize it. In traditional archival models, documents often appear as discrete objects or organized within hierarchical classification systems. The Gaza investigations exemplifies this relational structure. A satellite image gains significance through its correlation with witness, testimony, geolocation analysis, cartographic reconstruction, and temporal data. Meaning emerges not from isolated documents, but from networks of relations. This transformation has important political implications, drawing upon 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗁's concept of the distribution of the sensible. Visibility can be understood as the outcome of systems that determine what becomes perceptible and intelligible within public space. Interactive archives participate directly in these regimes of visibility. The same system that expand visibility simultaneously expose memory to new forms of vulnerability. The Gaza platforms embody a striking contradiction. They generate unprecedented forms of accessibility while relying upon technological environments whose permanence cannot be guaranteed. What must be preserved is no longer merely the document itself, but the entire technological ecology through which documentary memory becomes intelligible. This condition reveals what may be called the paradox of interactive memory. The archive becomes increasingly accessible while simultaneously becoming increasingly fragile. 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗁's reflection on fragmentation help illuminate this condition. Fragments survive not through completion, but through openness. Contemporary digital traces similarly persist within unfinished systems that remain subject to continual revision, expansion, interruption, and technological transformation. The question that emerges is no longer simply how traces are preserved, but how interactive systems themselves survive. If an interactive documentary loses its database structures, interface logic, metadata systems, or software architecture, essential dimensions of its intelligibility disappear. Forensic architectures platforms make this vulnerability particularly visible. Their value resides not simply in the traces they contain, but in the relationships they establish among those traces. Preservation, therefore, requires sustaining entire systems of interaction. From the perspective of Exile-Image, this condition may be understood as a new form of archival displacement. Traces survive, yet the infrastructures that render them meaningful remain unstable. Memory itself enters a condition of technological exile. The Gaza platforms point towards both the promise and the vulnerability of this future. They demonstrate how interactive documentary can generate new forms of democratic witnessing, public verification, and collective memory, while simultaneously revealing the fragility of the technological systems upon which such practices depend. Exile-Image ultimately designates this condition. The trace survives through displacement, yet its survival is never guaranteed. The trace contemporary memory increasingly depends upon fragile interactive infrastructures whose preservation has become one of the defining archive and political challenges of the digital age. Thanks so much.